Welcome to Art Destinations. My name is Sarah Rhodes, an artist based in Lutruwita, Tasmania. In this episode of Art Destinations, I am in conversation with photographic artist Davide Degano about what it means to be Italian. While studying photography at The Hague, Davide started a project focusing on the people living in Friuli, where he grew up in northern Italy, near the border of Slovenia. As someone who was born in Sicily with Columbian and Slovenian grandparents, identity has always been multidimensional. In the project Sclavanie, Davide started to investigate how people living in this border town see themselves and how they are perceived. The word Sclavanie is a derogatory term for Italian people with Slovenian descent. His work expanded into the project Romanzo Meticcio, which means mixed novel, to look at what it means to be Italian against the backdrop of Italy's fascist history. Art Destinations will be published fortnightly, and each season will focus on one place. The first season explores Venice and aims to provide an understanding of the layer tourists rarely see. This is our second last episode for the season, with the second season focusing on Tasmania and the third, Sicily. Please take a minute to sign up to the email newsletter on the website artdestinations.org and follow this podcast on your hosting platform so you don't miss an episode. In this episode, Davide and I catch up after first meeting in Venice when I was there last year. I became aware of Davide's work when I saw it as part of the Photographic Europea Festival in Reggio Emilia. Pop over to our Instagram page at artdestinations.podcast to see some of Davide's work from the series Sclavanie and Romanzo Meticcio. Welcome, Davide, to Art Destinations. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Hello, thanks, Sarah, for having me here.
So I just want to acknowledge that this episode is a little step away from the investigation of artists living and or working in Venice. We met in Venice while I was setting up for the Architecture Biennale last year, and you took a train to meet me from Friuli, the town where you grew up and are currently living. So we can imagine Venice as a place to share ideas, which is that Venice has a history of trade and of sharing ideas. So I think the link for me is this idea of sort of this generative place. And when we chatted earlier, you saw many parallels between Friuli and Venice as a place on the margins, where historically there have been multiple layers of culture and history. This is not the time to unpack those ideas, but I did want to say that the tension between the centre and the periphery, together with the notion of fluid boundaries that's emerged in this Art Destinations Venice season, expresses themselves differently in other locations, but nevertheless they exist. So through this conversation we can unpack some of those ideas. The first thing I wanted to discuss is some of the ideas that you're working through in your photographic practice. Now, when I asked you what your photographic practice was about, you essentially encapsulated the idea as what does it mean to be Italian? And I was just wondering what this question means to you.
Yeah, this question I think is quite important in contemporary days, and especially in Italy, in contemporary society. And for me, it means just to dig in the past to try to contextualize the present. So most of the time, both in history, the one that we are taught in school and the one that is passed on by our family, there are some gaps, and these gaps somehow they are really important to define our own identity. And so asking myself this question helps me to guide my artistic research.
Okay. So in terms of your own family history, what are you bringing to that question?
Well, my family is a bit all over the places. That's the reason why I wonder myself, what does it mean to be Italian? Because I was born in Sicily and I grew up in Friuli, both places at the margin, with a different yet similar story. My grandmother on my mother's side, she's originally from Colombia. Instead, my grandmother on my father's side, she's from Slovenia, or better, this place in the border between Friuli and Slovenia that once was Friuli and once was Slovenia, and by the time she reached 25, became Italy. So since I was a kid, I was accustomed to this multicultural environment, and hence the question, what does it mean to be Italian?
So were you aware when you were a child living in Friuli that you were, of mixed ethnicity, or was that something that was sort of never crossed your mind?
Well, never really in terms of family awareness. clearly, if I see my grandmother, my two grandmothers, they look quite different in terms of skin color and physiognomy. Yet I never really kind of paid much attention to it. But yeah, growing up, there was some sort of, I guess, indirect episodes that made me think once I grew up. When I used to go back to Sicily, they would not kind of recognize me as Sicilian because I grew up in the north, so my accent is from the north. And at the same time, when I was growing up in the north, there were always the use of an offensive word to stress my Sicilian roots, because my physical aspect is quite different from the people from Friuli. There was this kind of awareness, but while growing up, it was not really direct. It was more like kind of, I'm feeling something, but yeah, but yet I'm not able to grasp it yet. Yeah.
That's quite good, isn't it?
No, it's interesting. I mean, I never really had any trauma related to that, to be honest. It was just some sort of curiosity for certain jokes or certain words that they were thrown at me that I couldn't really give a real meaning because I wasn't using them toward the others, and so it was just kind of interesting to see that.
So you decided that your photographic exploration would be around cultural identity. What brought you to that decision?
Well, for instance, the same people that were kind of calling me terrone, which is a negative word to kind of stress the fact that someone is from the south, they are multicultural by themselves, meaning that most of the people in Friuli, they have a Slavic surname originally that has been Italianized after the fascism. The same happened to my grandmother. She had to decide whether to be Slovenian or Italian after Mussolini set the racial law. And so for me, it was quite kind of interesting that when you don't think about your past, you're so sure that you belong to a certain category, that you use this term which is pure and purity, and it's just enough to dig a bit further in your family past to just find out that perhaps you have multicultural links within your family. That most of the time it's not only a matter of skin color. And ethnicity brings different set of values and cultural heritage, but you need some time to dig further in it, because of course there is also the trauma coming from your ancestors. For instance, your grandfather and grandmother, they had to face fascism, so they had to hide an identity, and then most likely, most of the time, at least for my experience of the people I've met throughout my journey, they kept on hiding it. So that was kind of fascinating me a lot in terms of my research.
Okay, so you started working on a project called Sclavanie. Is that how we pronounce it? You went to university in The Hague. Can you talk a little bit about how that project evolved and what that project was?
Well, as you know, after 4 years in Australia, I moved back to Europe because it was a bit too pricey to attend an Academy of Art in Australia, in Melbourne, being overseas. And so, yeah, in Holland, as I started the academy, it was my first sort of academic approach to the medium of photography. So eventually they disassembled me as a maker, because my let's say my background is from commercial photography mainly. And then I started to study the visual storytelling subject, so how to tell a story through images. And in Holland, I couldn't really do it, or I wasn't able to do it because I could speak English, but I couldn't speak Dutch. So and people, when you can relate to them in their own language, as good as they can speak another language, is really different. So I started to travel back home in Friuli and see the place where I grew up with the eyes of a foreigner, but with the skills of a local. So I was able to move within the dynamics of the region as a local, because I guess I am. Yet being away for so much time, I started to see everything as a foreigner. And so I started to see a lot of cultural element in what was my daily life that before were unseen to me. And so the project started a bit in this way, as a sort of reconnection to part of my cultural heritage.
Okay. What do you think that you saw, or how did you see that place differently from coming in as an outsider?
Well, for instance, the traditions. So I started to relate tradition to certain cultural elements. So a lot of traditions are a mix between, for instance, pagan rituals and Christian rituals. So I started to dig and study the origins of both beliefs and how they somehow got together. I found out there was the key moment for the project that my grandmother was originally from Slovenia, so her surname was originally Slovenian, and I found it out when my mother was already passed away, and through a stranger. So I was photographing in this village by the border. And this old man, we started to chat and talk, and somehow he knew my father, and he gave a pretty clear and precise description of my father. And then he asked me suddenly, like, why don't you speak Slovenian? And he asked me that question in Slovenian. And I said, well, mainly, basically because I'm not Slovenian. That's the reason why. And so he showed me my grandmother house. And that was a pivotal moment for me, because at the beginning I was thinking that he made a mistake. He was unfortunately quite old. So I guess like the memory played a bad game to him. But then I went back home and asked my father, and he confirmed me that. So suddenly everything switched for me, and I started to see also in my family pictures, in the archival picture of my family, cultural elements. For instance, my father's family was really matriarchal, which is typical of Slavic population. And also my grandmother used to dress in a specific way that when I was a kid or when she was alive, I wasn't giving really much of a thought. Like, you see her every day, but you don't really relate the fact that she was always wearing a bandana covering her hair is something really specific of Slovenian women. Or these long dresses, and what she was eating and how she was eating, the place she had when the family was all united in during lunch or dinner time, the relation that she had with my grandfather, the type of relation she had. And suddenly I started to put together several dots and do comparison between, for instance, my mom's side of the family and my father's side of the family. And I started to see, cultural elements a bit everywhere, where before I was just thinking was just boring thing that was happening in my life.
That's interesting, growing up in a patriarchal society and having your mother coming from a matriarchal society.
Yeah. And having them so close in my house. So like, because really my grandfather on my mom's side, he's Sicilian. And as much as I love him, he was not really a great example of a man in terms of respecting women in general. It could be my grandmother, but also my mom. He was not, and it's still a taboo in my family. When I talk to my mom about it, she tells me stories. I can see her gaze a bit, between sad and sort of don't want to acknowledge that because she really loves him. But it is what it is, and he's really patriarchal. On the other side is my grandmother used to run the family. Literally. So she was a decision maker, and my grandfather was just a person that was providing the financial means for her to decide the direction for the family. So it was quite interesting, and also the relationship of respect they had one to another. So with my grandfather, the Sicilian side, there was not much of respect toward my grandmother figure. Whereas my grandfather on my dad's side, he was really respecting and listening to my grandmother. and so then that was really a starting point for me for a research that is still I'm still doing, because is a lot of documents that I found over the time, of course, are in Slovenian, and Slovenian is a language that I don't speak, so most of the time I have to get the documents translated or doing it in a bit kind of rough way through Google and all this kind of, and of course then the understanding of the document is my understanding gets a bit slower because I need to reread it, interpret it, but it's quite a fascinating process, I think.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by that. I found that really exciting to think about that. So you've come from The Hague, you're visiting Friuli, you're exploring, your neighbours, your family, your friends. What was your photographic approach?
My approach was it was really slow. So through several attempts in at the academy, I found out that each photographic language as a meaning. So it's just like when you play guitar, or an instrument, you need to know what you're trying to say, and a specific chord can deliver a specific message. So I was introduced to the academy to analog photography and more in particular to large format photography, and so I thought that was the pace I had to take to explore this border area where a slow pace and really an attitude of listening to people is quite crucial, because eventually the people here are really open when they get to know you and trust you. But before you reach that stage, you need to show them respect and more specifically show them interest, which is a thing that I try to extend to my practice when I take a lot of portraits, and I tend to work with people a lot, and so I think that you can show at least interest to the person in front of you and being genuinely interested to what they have to tell you.
So are you making straight portraits, and are you making landscapes? I mean, what's your actual approach, and what are you trying to convey?
I try to use a multidisciplinary approach. So together with my picture, they usually are a mix between portraiture, landscape, and details. I mix them with archival material that can be both historical, so actual documents that I found in archives and so on, but also pictures of the people that I photograph. Most of the time, they, at least for Sclavanie, but also for Romanzo Meticcio, they just invited me at home and open up their family history. So I was having access to their family pictures too, and then I tend to collaborate also with professionals from different fields. And so that usually is my approach. If I have to talk about just my photography, is mainly a mixture between portraiture, landscape, and details, and I tend to do it over a long time period. So it's not a touch and go sort of approach, but most of the time I would just go to visit, to explore, or visit a place. Sometimes also without the camera. So it was just like to show my face and show and present myself. And then one step at a time, I would start to photograph perhaps the landscape, the architecture, and step by step, little by little, I would start to approach the people and create a relationship that will eventually turn into a portrait.
I have a question. When you go to a place and you experience it for the first time, you can take quite a different picture to what you take if you've been with that person for a long time. Sometimes the first picture can be the best because there's that freshness, and then sometimes, not that it's the last, because what is the last, but how do you balance that? Because sometimes when you meet someone, you might want to meet them a few times first, but then does that mean that you can miss that first time, or do you take that first time?
Well, it's a really interesting question that I struggle to answer myself. I mean, is a bit kind of surfing a wave, and then you know a bit the technique, but you kind of figure it out like on the spot. So of course, if there is a possibility to take the picture during the first encounter, I'll do it. And I always do it, and indeed, most of the time, these one are the best pictures in some sort of way. That the ones that at least when I see them back and I print them and I see them and I try to kind of read them from a detached point of view than me being the author of that picture, are the one that speaks to me the most. By the same time, I think one of my best picture was the last picture I took. For instance, in Sclavanie, was the cover of the book is the last picture I took of that man, and unfortunately, it's also the last picture someone took of him because he passed away a few months ago, and that picture came after 5 years of dialogues. So is really kind of difficult to predict that. I can be sure in terms of my attitude is that if I feel some sort of tension, meaning tension is always positive, so I always try to have that, but tension meaning in this case like not willingness to be photographed, I rather not do it, because I know that it's going to be, unless the rare case is not a great picture. And so I perhaps do it the next time and the following one, because when you don't want to be photographed, is eventually when you manage to take the picture is always you've been convincing someone. So there is always a sort of tension lying in there. It's never like 200% comfortable. There is always this tension. So that is how I try to handle that.
There's a connection between you and the subject. So when we spoke earlier as well, you were talking about playing around with the fact and fiction when you're making your portraits or when you're telling your stories, and that you don't feel that you're working in a strictly documentary sense. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I found a really interesting. I don't remember who said it. I think Gregory Alper was explaining this idea that at the end of the day, fiction and reality are kind of overlapping as concepts, because eventually my reality is the fiction I make out of it. So we all have different realities. So there is no something that can be defined as truth if you see it under that point of view. And so also my understanding and what I see in terms of the photographic medium, I really struggle to see it as something that can tell the truth. Of course, it depends on the context of where the medium is being used. So like if you use it for scientific archivation of something, that can be like the exact, what you see is what you get. But in terms of using the photography medium to tell a story, is fictional already by default. You don't need to be in a studio or create a scene from scratch, but you can rearrange something in real life. And so even though the iconographic image refers to something that it might be real to you in terms of human experience that you've been experiencing, it's not real in terms of truth. So it's always something that comes, is always something fictional and is free to be interpreted. For me, it was a key element when I started to approach visual storytelling and photo books, especially because at the beginning I was really thinking this kind of idea that photography can change the world or tell the truth through photography. But instead, I think that the real power of photography is actually the fact that is so incomplete as a medium, and you can just give suggestions to the viewer. And that's the best way to tell a story, because you give room to questions more than provide answers. So that for me is the most fascinating thing of the medium.
Oh, I really like that. The idea that photography is incomplete, or make something that's incomplete. That's very good.
Yeah, because you can, like in a movie, a love scene eventually develops in terms of a love scene. You can be explicit or perhaps a bit less subtle, but that you actually see it. In photography, you can give the hint of being a love scene, but perhaps if the following that if the picture that follows that kind of picture might give another hint that love scene can become, I don't know, a fight, a murder. Like there is not really set, it's not really clear, and hence it's not really binary in terms of truth or true or false. And I think it's quite fascinating.
So does that mean that you're changing how you read photographs, or that thinking about that changes how you make photographs?
I guess both. Like when you read photographs, of course, is each of us reads them in a different way according to, I believe, to a set of experiences you've been kind of gathering throughout your life, culturally, academically, in terms of actual life experience. So that is, I think, is a huge filter that each of us apply when it comes to read a picture. But also as a maker, but also the picture itself changes the meaning according to the historical period in which it's used and the context in which the picture is used. So as a maker, for me, it's really important that when I take the picture and I use my picture, I need to really much to contextualize it within what I want to try to say. And because the same picture for me is used to tell one story, someone can download it, screenshot it, put a different caption, and suddenly it becomes the opposite. As I said before, it's the beauty of the photographic medium, but also something to be really aware of, because it can be, I mean, there's been examples in history where dictatorship were actually stabilized thanks to the use of good design and good images, and proper use of good design and good images to direct the creation of a certain type of culture and way of seeing the world. So I think that as image makers and people that work with visuals in general, we have to be really aware of.
So would you say that with the idea that photography makes something that's incomplete, you would be more focused on the fragments or the incomplete nature of it, or that doesn't really come into play? It's more that is just the natural outcome?
Well, to me, is the natural outcome, but I will focus on that. I will just stress that element of photography, because as we were talking earlier, or perhaps in Venice too, through my research, I try to raise more questions than give answers. And to me, that is the best way to try to start to understand a specific topic or a specific issues. So for me, that is really the key point, like the incompleteness that somehow becomes complete when it gives you a new way of seeing to a specific issue, but it's still incomplete because you can counterattack what you've just found out with another set of questions. So to me, that is really interesting. Yeah.
Just bringing it back to when you're collaborating with the urban planner or the anthropologist in the Sclavanie project, that's kind of a fragmented approach as well in a way, because you're inviting people to collaborate and bring input in. Both of those disciplines are kind of social sciences, or they're quite sort of concrete disciplines compared with the visual arts. Or how was the final outcome? How was their contribution? How did you manage their contribution?
Well, yeah, it was interesting because there you go, another contradiction. So you come someone a professional that is basing his own research and practice on certainties, on scientific facts. You call him or her to collaborate with you on something that you find not kind of, on something that you base not on scientific facts, but rather the opposite. And well, it was really interesting because I asked them to try to get this approach and to try to experience that. And funny enough, they have the same sort of experience in front of a picture. So they may just look at them with more cultural background in terms of their practice. But at the same time, there was some uncertainties, and that's the reason why the research is still going on. Usually the type of professional researchers, they carry on a research on one topic throughout their career. So in some ways, what we call scientific facts are not always enough to explain a story, because then usually the story involves also human beings and human relationships that are difficult to channel within a scientific formula. And so for me, it was really interesting, this exchange of opinion, and our meetings gave birth to really nice conversation that somehow were helping me to see the world I was photographing in a different way, meaning see elements that they would be unnoticed to me, but elements that I wouldn't grasp, and because of that I wouldn't be able to grasp. So then I was able to get them visually, yet not understanding them, and so that was creating a sort of tension within the narration. And their contribution was also really important because it gave a bit of context to the whole history. That was a bit important as a starting point, because we talk about identity, some border that was frontier that became border, people that had to choose whether to stay on whether to be Italian or Slovenian, whether to families that they were split because of that decision. So there is a sort of traumatic element that needs to be contextualized, I think. And from there we can start a sort of dialogue that, more than what happened in the past, a dialogue that kind of brings questions to the present to kind of progress in the future. But a bit of historical contextualization, I think it was important, not to be too banal in what I was saying. Yeah.
What's the second project that you worked on?
Romanzo Meticcio.
Romanzo Meticcio.
Yeah, Romanzo means novel, Meticcio means mixed.
Mixed novel.
Yeah, mixed novel. Yeah. But Meticcio is a term in Italy is used to say a mixture of culture. It can be racial, ethnic. Meticcio is someone that is not pure, and it was a word that was kind of. It is a bit, even right now. It's not really kind of. You have to be cautious when you use it, but it was used really much during fascist time, trying to prevent people to be meticci. But it's also a word that has been told to me several times when I was a kid, and so I think it was appropriate to describe the current Italian situation and the history of the Italian peninsula. I mean, it's always been a place where several cultures were kind of passing by and mixing together. So I think it was a provocatory title that I think is needed as much as Sclavanie, because Sclavanie was a term that was used to describe a geographical area, so the area bordering between Italy and Slovenia, and it was created by the Venetian authorities when they conquer this part of Italy, and it actually means the Venetian Slav land. Throughout history, Sclavanie became a derogatory term. So now a person would appoint someone as Sclav to kind of stress his inferiority. But the person, they use that word to insult the other person, most of the time have an Italianized surname. So his surname originally is from Slavic roots. And so that an element of interest for me, because when you lose connection with your roots, with the history of the place where you were born, you lose connection to who you actually are in terms of cultural heritage, and so you end up insulting someone for something that you have within your persona, even though is not, you don't know it. It's still there. And so these two titles were a bit provocatory, but sometimes you need that to trigger some thoughts, I guess.
Can you describe what the Romanzo Meticcio project is? What does it look like, and what's the main sort of thread of that story?
Yeah, sure. Romanzo Meticcio basically is a continuation of Sclavanie, where I just extend the question, what does it mean to be Italian, to the whole country. So again, as I mentioned before, I start from my family background, and then I moved through the studying of margins. So I try to to give and bring to the table another type of narration than the official one that has been given to us since the unification of the country. So I think for the first time, the margins are telling the story, the identity history of Italy. Margins that I think now are constituting the core of Italian identity. Yet they have no voice, and they are most of the time not recognized as Italians. And that has a really several cultural, but if you want to say also in a bit more kind of capitalistic way, as also economical consequences for the country. So if you don't want to acknowledge certain elements because of their rights to be Italian, you should at least acknowledge the economical flaws you have by doing so.
So what are the pictures? What's the story? What can we see?
I'm basically kind of questioning the Italian identity to its core, and again I'm doing that by exploring the margins and what is being marginalized throughout Italian history, meaning the people from the south, the second, third, and now almost fourth generations of Italian, cultural and linguistic minorities, and I do that by considering all these marginalized categories in their coexistence. So not one by one, but considering them in their overlapping within society. And I do this also using archival materials from the past, especially from the fascist time, and how the fascist regime molded and transformed the what Italian sees as Italian. So in the name of science. So I'm using that as starting point and try to make to create a dialogue between the past and the present.
Okay. So I saw this work in Reggio Emilia when I was there last year, in 2023. It was hanging in the Natural History Museum, I think, upstairs.
Yeah.
And there were pictures. It was really clever, and that's how we met, actually, because I was posting those pictures on Instagram because I thought they were so great. And you focused on an apartment block in that exhibition?
Yeah. The apartment block is social housing, and it was the first apartment my grandfather got when he moved from the south to the north. It was for him almost impossible to find a house because there were literally banners saying we don't rent houses to southerners, and so it was just the only option he had, and the little box with, I don't know if you remember, with the slides inside, was a sort of invitation to step into what it was at the time unknown and to see what was inside. So it was my family. So those were a family picture, and suddenly you see more things you can relate to than what someone else made you afraid of. And that is a bit actually the starting point of the whole project. Then it carries on with the people that live nowadays in those type of apartments, which are Italian, and the society and the Italian government still struggle to recognize as such. We still have, I think, Italy, and I don't remember. I read the other day the other country, which I forgot. I think Germany, I don't remember which one, is the only country in the world still that gives citizenship through bloodline, which is quite absurd. Because if you are born from immigrants' parents in Australia, I think you get the Australian passport. If you are born in Australia. In Italy, if you are born from immigrants' parents, you don't get the citizenship. You don't get the passport. You just have a permit that you have to renovate until you are 18, and then you need to start at the age of 16 and a half, 17, the process for getting citizenship, which means you are not fully recognized by your birthplace. And it's absurd because you are born in a place, and even though you have cultural backgrounds, that's what I really believe, that you have cultural backgrounds. So this deform you as a persona, but what creates you as a person, you want it or not, is the place where you're born and raised. Because you pick the accent, you pick the habits, you pick and you mix all of this with the cultural background of, for instance, your parents. And so in Italy, until you are 18, you are not recognized as Italian. And what does that mean? It means that, for instance, when you go, you cannot go on a school trip if the school trip is abroad. So you have to stay at home. You cannot go, or if the school trip is in Italy, when it comes to show your ID, you need to go on a separate line because you don't have an actual Italian ID, but you have a permit. So there is different type of controls that, of course, if when it's not your problem, you think, okay, but it's just, it's not that they do something to you. You just have to go on a different line and show that, and then you go back with your classmates. But we underestimate these little elements in someone else's life. They can create doubts. They can create a sort of uneasiness to do that. To always need to reply why you do that, because your friends, they see you as, you grew up with them, so they see you as local as they can be, but then you have every time to justify the reason why you are there, and I find it quite absurd. The concept of being Italian through bloodline is really much fascist in terms of belief, what is at the base of our society right now, and I think it's quite also scaring that politicians don't see it as really kind of, almost from both sides, I have to say, they don't see it as a really important element to change in our country. And so the project is about that, about the issues we have, but it's not pointing finger to a specific political group or something of this nature. Is actually pointing fingers to ourselves, to our education system.
So the images are mainly showing how people live.
You see a lot of elements that are common to us, but you see also elements that are foreign to you. For me, certain elements are familiar because I photographed some Colombian descendants, so what I saw at home in terms of food and everything is quite familiar. But it becomes unfamiliar when I photograph some Albanian descendant or some Bosnian descendant or African descendants. But yet there is a lot of familiarity in the rest of it. So is this game of presenting two different elements that coexist in the same household and together with elements from the past. So I've been gathering a lot of articles from magazines that were published during the 30s and 40s that, for instance, my grandfather perhaps had subscribed to. So it's what you were reading daily, and they're quite shocking magazines, like literally shocking. And that is the education my grandparents had. Then I also found school books, school notebooks. So it's what the kids were studying and learning in school in the 30s. And it also is quite shocking. But it's also important to see that more than pointing fingers, to understand the reason why we are as a society right now, because that is the point. And so by kind of connecting the two dots, you should try to be able to raise questions and find solutions for the present and future generations.
I guess essentially the way of life in a ethnically diverse family in Italy would still have an underlying Italian way of living compared with in Australia. It would be an underlying Australian way of living. But essentially I'm just thinking, if you did that project in another place, how many parallels would you find? I mean, what is it? Is this a universal story? I guess is the question I'm asking.
Absolutely. I think it's a universal story. And then there is the country within you do it as a different degree of awareness of that. That can be it. For instance, in Europe, England, France, Portugal, they have an awareness of their colonial past, really, really much there. And there's been studies about that now, like since the 60s, 70s. The awareness that Italy has about its colonial past is almost to zero. The idea is still that we had it only for 5 years and we were not that bad compared to the others. So But the colonies in Africa, which is not true, is almost 100 years if you think about it, because it's 1885 or 1886 to 1941. It's not really 5 years. It's not 300 years like the others. It's not for economical reasons. You didn't make your fortune out of that, but it doesn't mean that it's less important. Actually, you did it because of ideology, which is perhaps more dangerous than for economical reasons. And so that I would see the difference between Italy and the rest, because Italy is also a country of immigrants, and it's really rare to see in a society that colonize a society of immigrants. Usually, who colonize is not a society of people like where their own citizens are emigrating somewhere else. And so this is also the particular case of Italy compared to the rest of European cities. And so that is, I think, the difference. But in general terms, I think is a universal story that all countries in Europe and not are facing. Yeah. No, absolutely, I think that.
Okay, so you've made a project about where you've grown up. Are you considering making something around Sicily and where you were born?
Yeah, I think it will be my next step. Yeah, I did Sclavanie, where I grew up, Romanzo Meticcio, which is my next work and is coming out right now as a photo book. I mean, soon, I guess, in September. That kind of expands my research to the whole country. And now I want to narrow it down again to Sicily. I have several ideas. I don't know which one to explore first. To me, it's really interesting for the legend of the Testa di Moro or the Black Madonna as a worship, or Lombroso, which was Lombroso was a researcher that theorized the inborn ability to be a criminal for people from the South. So he made a scientific research, according to him, where he was stating that people from the South, they had some features that in their DNA that were kind of leading them to be a criminal. And he classified, according to a certain ethnographic research, each type of criminal from different parts from the South. So from instance, the Sicilian would be a thief and a murderer. A person from Naples would be a murderer as well. So he created this kind of classification through ethnographic studies. And so I have these 3 or 4 key elements to start a new research in Sicily. Yeah, I feel it as the kind of natural way to carry on my studies.
Okay, that's probably a really good point to end, I think, because I'm about to step outside my knowledge.
Okay, or even mine. I'm still researching, so I've thrown on the table everything I know.
Thank you so much, David. It was really, really interesting, and it was a lovely sort of neat thread from the beginning of your interest to now. So I really appreciate you being so generous and sharing your research with us.
Thanks to you for having me. Thanks so much.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the 7th episode of Art Destinations Venice. In our final episode of the Venice season, we will be in conversation with gastronomer Lorenzo Barbasetti de Prun, who forages for sea fennel seeds and other native salt-loving plants on the island shores in the Venetian lagoon. He wants to innovate our approach to food in order to adapt to the changing climate. Lorenzo explains how tradition is a risk to diversity and the evolution of culture. Please sign up to our fortnightly newsletter, follow artdestinations.podcast on Instagram to see examples of the work featured in our conversations, and follow us on your podcast hosting platform. I'm your host, Sarah Rhodes. Ciao for now.